Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever felt the weight of the world collapse into silence? That one moment when words fail, noise disappears, and all that remains is you raw, real, and still. It's in that moment where silence breathes louder than chaos that transformation begins. We live in a world addicted to noise. We equate silence with awkwardness. We run from it. We fill it with words, sounds, distractions. But what if I told you that asterisk, everything you're seeking, clarity, healing, strength asterisk, begins where the noise ends? In a world constantly humming with noise, silence is often misunderstood. People confuse it with emptiness, with void, with lack. But silence, in its truest form, is not about the absence of sound, it's about the presence of something deeper. It is not emptiness, it is clarity. And the moment we begin to realize that, we stop fearing it and start honoring it. We live in a culture that rewards the loudest voice, the fastest response, the strongest opinion. We're encouraged to speak up, to fill space, to be heard. But the danger in always needing to express, always needing to answer, is that we rarely stop to understand. We rarely stop to listen, not just to others, but to ourselves. That's where silence becomes a gift. Silence gives you back your own voice. Not the one shaped by expectations or pressure, but the voice that comes from within, the one you forgot how to hear. In the stillness, thoughts settle. Emotions surface, the truth begins to appear, not because we chased it down, but because we allowed it to rise. That's clarity. Think of water. When it's stirred and chaotic, it becomes cloudy, but when you let it rest, let it be still, it clears. You begin to see through it. That's what silence does to the mind. In silence, the mind stops rushing to respond and starts allowing insight to enter. Ideas that seemed out of reach before suddenly appear. Answers you've been looking for, direction you've been seeking. It all begins to come into focus. The irony is, we often fill our lives with noise trying to find peace. We scroll through endless information, surround ourselves with chatter, keep ourselves busy, all because we believe that doing more will help us understand more. But understanding doesn't always come through activity. Sometimes it comes through presence, through a moment of silence that reminds you, you don't need to chase every answer. Some answers come to you when you pause. Silence is not passive, it's active awareness. It is choosing not to react so that you can respond with purpose. It's creating space for reflection, and in doing so, you reconnect with your values, your priorities, your truth. You begin to see what matters and what doesn't. You start to recognize the difference between what's urgent and what's important. You start making decisions not out of panic, but out of clarity. This is especially true in times of difficulty. When life becomes overwhelming, the instinct is often to panic, to vent, to drown in noise. But silence offers an alternative. It becomes your anchor. It doesn't erase the storm, but it reminds you that you can find your center even within it. When everything feels like it's spinning, silence tells you, you don't have to spin with it. It is in these quiet moments that growth happens. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. You begin to see your patterns, your fears, your beliefs. You recognize what you've been running from and what you truly desire. This kind of clarity doesn't come from external advice or opinions. It comes from you, from the part of you that only speaks when it's quiet enough to be heard. Even in relationships, silence plays a powerful role. We often try to fill silence with words, assuming that more communication equals better connection. But sometimes the most meaningful connections happen in shared stillness, a pause that says, "I'm here," a moment of quiet that holds space for understanding. True listening doesn't happen when you're busy preparing your next sentence. It happens when you let silence exist between words. So no, silence is not emptiness. It is not a lack of thought or action or substance. It is the birthplace of understanding. It is the space where truth surfaces, where emotions are felt, where intentions are purified. It is clarity distilled and undiluted, and in that clarity, everything begins to flow. Not because you forced it to, but because you finally allowed it to. The next time you find yourself in silence, resist the urge to fill it, listen to it, stay with it, because what you'll find in that space is not emptiness, but yourself, and there is no greater clarity than that. Resilience is often portrayed as strength under pressure, the ability to keep going no matter how hard life hits. It's the unshakable mindset, the unbreakable will, the loud declaration of "I will not give up." But true resilience isn't always loud. It doesn't always roar. In fact, some of the strongest forms of resilience are shaped in silence, when no one is watching, when there are no words left to say, and when the only sound you hear is your own heartbeat, still moving forward. Silence builds resilience not because it removes the storm, but because it teaches you how to stand still in the middle of it. It offers no distractions, no instant relief, no false comfort. What it gives instead is presence. Raw, real presence with your own pain, your own doubts, your own fears. And in facing these things without running, without numbing, you begin to grow. Not overnight, not dramatically, but deeply and permanently. In silence, you come face to face with the very things you try to avoid. The disappointments you've buried, the grief you haven't processed, the anger you pretend isn't there. They rise to the surface, and instead of drowning in them, silence gives you a chance to observe them. To feel them fully, to understand them, it's in that confrontation, uncomfortable as it may be, that inner strength begins to form. Resilience is not the denial of pain, it is the quiet acceptance that pain is a part of the journey and the decision to keep going anyway. Silence teaches that when you stop distracting yourself, you realize how capable you actually are. You recognize that you've survived everything you once thought would break you. You remember your past struggles, not as scars to hide, but as reminders that you are still here. There is a sacred power in the stillness where nothing is happening on the outside, but everything is transforming on the inside. That's the space where you begin to trust yourself, not because others validate you, but because you see yourself holding steady when everything feels uncertain. You begin to trust your ability to sit with discomfort without losing hope, to hold fear without letting it control you, to feel vulnerable and still move forward. Silence is also the space where reflection happens. When life moves fast, we often react out of habit, fear, or pressure, but in silence there is time to pause, to think, to ask, what do I really want? What am I learning from this? What is this pain trying to teach me? And in those answers, however slowly they come, you find direction. You find purpose in the pain, and that gives you something to hold on to when things fall apart. Think of the strongest people you know, the ones who have endured loss, setbacks, heartbreak, and still walk with kindness and grace. They may not have shouted their struggle to the world. Many of them suffered in silence, rebuilt in silence, healed in silence. But that silence didn't weaken them. It refined them. It made them resilient not just in how they coped, but in how they carried themselves after the storm. Resilience built in silence is not the kind that burns out or breaks down. It's steady, grounded. It doesn't need attention or applause. It exists quietly, firmly, and undeniably. It's the kind of strength that allows you to walk away when needed, to rest when necessary, and to rise again when the time is right. Even in daily life, the practice of silence strengthens your emotional endurance. When you pause before reacting, when you take a moment to breathe instead of breaking down, when you sit in solitude and regroup rather than explode, you're training your resilience. You're learning to respond from stability, not stress. You're choosing awareness over impulse, and that choice, repeated over time, makes you unshakable. So yes, silence builds resilience, not because it fixes everything, but because it teaches you how to face everything. It doesn't offer escape, but it offers presence, and in that presence you meet your fears, your pain, your strength, and realize they can all exist together, that you can feel broken and still be whole, that you can fall and still rise, and that your greatest power doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it only needs to be heard. The silence you once feared, but now call home. There are moments in life when words fail, when emotions are too deep, too raw, or too sacred to be captured in sentences. In those moments, silence steps in, not as a gap, not as a weakness, but as a powerful presence, Silence speaks louder than words, not because it fills space, but because it creates space. Space for truth, space for understanding, space for connection. We are taught to value expression, to believe that saying more means understanding more. We rush to explain ourselves, to defend, to clarify, to respond. But often, the most profound messages are not delivered through speech. They're felt in the pause between words, in a steady gaze, in a moment of stillness when everything that needs to be said already lives in the silence. Think of the times you've comforted someone in pain. Maybe you sat beside them without saying a thing, no advice, no solutions, just presence, and in that silence, something sacred happened. They felt seen. They felt understood, because in that quiet moment, your silence said, "I'm here. I see your pain. You're not alone." No sentence could have said it better. Words can be powerful, but they also have limits. They can be misunderstood, twisted, or fall short of the truth. Silence, on the other hand, is honest. It doesn't try to impress or persuade. It simply is, and because of that, it carries a certain authenticity, a kind of emotional gravity that words often lack. When someone holds a moment of silence, people pay attention. When you pause before answering, you're not only giving weight to your response, you're inviting reflection. That's the power of unspoken communication. It isn't passive, it's intentional. Silence also demands vulnerability. Speaking is often easier than sitting in silence, especially in uncomfortable situations. We use words to fill space, to protect ourselves, to avoid facing what we truly feel. But silence strips that away. It leaves us exposed, and in that exposure, we confront what is real. We're forced to feel, to listen, to process. Not just the world around us, but the world within us. Silence can be a bridge or a barrier, depending on how it's used. But when used with awareness and love, it can create the deepest forms of connection. Two people sitting in silence, comfortable in each other's presence, share something rare. A bond that doesn't need constant affirmation. A silence that says you don't have to perform for me, you just have to be. Sometimes the loudest message is in the words not said, in forgiveness that isn't spoken but shown, in grief that is shared without narration, in love that is expressed not through grand declarations, but through quiet consistency. Actions often carry the soul of what we mean, and silence gives those actions the room to resonate. Silence can be strength. Not the kind that shuts down or avoids, but the kind that pauses, reflects, and responds with intention. It is in those moments, when we choose not to retaliate, when we breathe instead of react, that we exercise emotional maturity. And sometimes that pause can change the entire tone of a conversation. Silence becomes the moment we choose peace over pride. It's also a mirror. When you sit in silence with yourself, you begin to hear the thoughts that are usually drowned out by noise. You notice patterns in your mind, truths you've ignored, and emotions you've suppressed. It can be uncomfortable at first, but eventually that silence becomes a source of clarity. It becomes your compass. You begin to trust your inner voice more than the noise around you. We often think influence comes from speaking loudly, making a statement, commanding attention, but real influence, lasting influence, often comes from presence. From stillness, from the power of being deeply rooted and fully aware. Silence commands attention because it's rare. In a world where everyone is trying to be heard, the one who chooses silence stands out. Not because they have nothing to say, but because what they're saying goes beyond words. So, the next time you feel the urge to speak just to fill the air, pause, sit with the silence, let it say what words cannot. Because in that stillness, you'll find that the most profound truths, the deepest connections, and the most transformative moments are not always spoken. They're felt. And in that feeling, silence speaks louder than any voice ever could. Every day, we are faced with decisions, some small and fleeting, others lie faltering. In a world that moves at a relentless pace, we are often pushed to make choices quickly, to respond immediately, to act without pause. But decisions made in haste, under pressure, or in the noise of external voices rarely reflect our deepest truths. That is why silence is essential. It is in silence that decision-making becomes empowered, not rushed. It becomes deliberate, not reactive. Silence gives you the space to listen to yourself before listening to the world. It allows you to separate the voice of fear from the voice of intuition. When everything around you is shouting for attention, expectations, opinions, deadlines, silence offers a moment of calm, a clearing in the chaos. It doesn't remove the complexity of life's choices, but it creates the clarity to face them with intention. In silence, you are not trying to prove anything. You are not performing. You are not arguing or explaining. You are simply being, and in that state of being, your mind begins to slow down. The mental fog starts to lift. Emotions settle, and what was once confusing begins to feel a little clearer. You start to sense what feels right, not just what looks right. That is the beginning of empowered decision-making. Some of the most regrettable choices in life come from moments of noise, from being overwhelmed, emotional, hurried, or pressured by others. We've all made decisions we later questioned, not because we lacked intelligence, but because we lacked space. We lacked that moment of stillness that allows us to check in with ourselves and ask, is this choice aligned with who I am? Is this what I truly want, or am I being pulled by something outside of me? Silence helps us confront the truth beneath the surface. Sometimes it reveals fears we didn't know were influencing us. Sometimes it uncovers desires we've been ignoring. And sometimes it simply reminds us that we already know the answer. We just needed to quiet the noise long enough to hear it. The world values speed and certainty, but wisdom requires patience and presence. Silent reflection gives you both. It teaches you to delay unnecessary urgency. It teaches you to pause, not as an excuse to avoid, but as a strategy to respond better. When you allow yourself time to be still, you become less reactive and more thoughtful. You begin to weigh your options not just logically, but emotionally and spiritually. You learn to consider the impact of your decisions not only in the moment, but in the long run. And when you finally do make a decision from that quiet, grounded place, it carries a different kind of strength. It's not loud or impulsive. It's steady, confident, rooted in self-awareness. You're no longer acting out of fear of missing out or fear of judgment. You're choosing with clarity, knowing that whatever comes, you made the choice with integrity. Silence also helps you stay connected to your values. When you remove distractions and sit with yourself, you remember what matters most. You remember your priorities. That memory becomes a compass. And with a clear compass, you make decisions not just based on circumstances, but based on what aligns with the life you want to live. You begin to notice how often you say yes to things that drain you, how often you act out of habit rather than heart, and how often you confuse motion for progress. In silence, those patterns become visible, and once they're visible, they can be changed. This is not to say that silence guarantees the perfect decision. Life is uncertain. Outcomes aren't always in our control. But when a decision is made from a place of peace, not panic, it brings something even more valuable, inner alignment. Even if things don't unfold exactly as planned, you can stand by your choice. You can trust your process, and that trust gives you resilience. So, before your next big decision, pause. Before answering the next demand, sit quietly. Breathe, listen, create space between the question and your response. Let silence do its work, not by telling you what to do, but by helping you remember what you already know. Because the answers we seek aren't always out there. Often, they're waiting inside, just beneath the noise, and only silence can lead us to them. In a world constantly buzzing with information, notifications, conversations, and expectations, creativity often struggles to breathe. Self-discovery becomes lost in the noise of comparison and distraction. We're so busy absorbing external input that we forget to tune into the quiet voice within us, the one that holds our imagination, our dreams, our truth. And that is where silence becomes not just useful, but necessary, because silence nurtures creativity and self-discovery in ways noise never can. Creativity is not something you force. It's not a machine you switch on at will. It flows when there is space. It grows in stillness. The mind needs time to wander, to explore, to imagine without rules. When we constantly occupy ourselves, scrolling, talking, rushing, we leave no room for our ideas to unfold naturally. Silence is the fertile ground in which imagination takes root. It is the soft, undisturbed soil where inspiration is born. Think about the moments when your best ideas came to you. Were you in a crowded room, in the middle of a busy task, or were you alone? In the shower, walking quietly, staring out the window, or sitting in stillness? The mind, when given a moment to rest, becomes open. It stops reacting and starts creating. This openness cannot be forced through activity. It comes only when we dare to be still long enough to let our inner world speak. In silence, the inner dialogue begins to surface, not the noise of anxiety or overthinking, but the deeper voice underneath. The one that says, this is what moves me, this is what I want to create, this is what I'm curious about. That's where self-discovery begins, not in chasing what others are doing, but in listening to what you are being called to do. Silence removes the mask. It gently strips away the identities we wear to impress or conform. In the quiet, we meet ourselves without judgment or performance. We begin to notice what truly excites us and what drains us. We recognize the difference between what we've been taught to value and what we actually value, and that self-awareness becomes the foundation for authentic living and authentic creating. Great artists, writers, thinkers, and innovators have always understood the importance of silence, not because they feared noise, but because they knew that genius is often found in solitude. They stepped away from the world not to escape it, but to return with something meaningful. And that can only happen when you give yourself permission to disconnect from the external and reconnect with the internal. In silence, the mind isn't being told what to think, it starts to ask questions. New perspectives form, dots connect that were never visible before. Silence becomes the canvas where your imagination paints freely, without deadlines, without judgment, without the pressure of being right. It's a space of freedom, and that freedom is where originality is born. It also creates space for emotional exploration. In silence, you become more aware of your inner experiences. You feel your feelings without needing to label them or explain them away. You begin to understand why certain things move you and why others don't. That emotional insight fuels creativity. Because real art, real expression, real innovation comes not just from the mind, but from the heart. And perhaps most importantly, silence teaches patience. Creativity and self-discovery are not instant processes. They unfold over time. They require you to sit in the unknown, to wait without rushing, to let things come when they're ready. In silence, you learn to respect that rhythm. You stop demanding immediate results and start allowing a natural unfolding. That patience not only deepens your creativity, it deepens your relationship with yourself. When you spend time in silence, you begin to realize that you are not empty without noise. You are, in fact, full of ideas, dreams, feelings, questions, and truths that have simply been waiting for your attention. Silence gives them room to rise. It creates the still waters in which your reflection becomes clear. So, take the time to step away, not forever, but just long enough to hear yourself think, long enough to feel your own soul speak. In that quiet space, you will find the seeds of your next idea, your next vision, your next version of yourself. And when you return to the world, you won't just be reacting to it. You'll be offering something of your own, something real, something born in silence, something only you could have discovered. Emotional intelligence isn't just about recognizing emotions in others or expressing your own with clarity. At its core, emotional intelligence is about awareness. Deep, honest, and unfiltered awareness of what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, and how to respond rather than react. And nothing sharpens that awareness like silence. In a world where we are constantly encouraged to speak, to explain, to broadcast every emotion, silence becomes a radical act of self-connection. It's in silence that we finally get the chance to feel, observe, and truly understand ourselves and others. Most people are not actually aware of what they feel. They know they're upset, anxious, irritated, but the root of those emotions remains hidden. That's because our fast-paced, noisy lives rarely give us the opportunity to pause and reflect. Silence offers that pause. It creates a space between stimulus and response, between emotion and action. In that space, awareness grows. You begin to notice subtle emotions before they become overwhelming. You start to question, why am I reacting this way? Is this anger or is it hurt? Is this fear or is it uncertainty? Those kinds of questions can only be asked and answered in silence. When you practice silence regularly, you begin to catch your emotional patterns. You start to recognize how certain situations trigger you, how old wounds influence your reactions, and how your own expectations create internal pressure. That self-recognition is the first step to emotional intelligence. Because you cannot manage what you don't understand, and you cannot understand what you don't take the time to feel. Silence also helps you break the habit of emotional reactivity. Instead of snapping in anger or shutting down in sadness, silence gives you a moment to breathe. It's in that breath that you gain perspective. You shift from reacting on impulse to responding with intention. That shift is what makes someone emotionally intelligent. Not the absence of emotion, but the ability to navigate emotion with maturity and grace. Silence isn't just a tool for understanding yourself. It's also one of the most powerful ways to understand others. In silence, you become a better listener. Not just to words, but to tone, body language, hesitation, and silence itself. You begin to pick up on the emotions behind the words, the things left unsaid, the subtle signals of joy, fear, or pain. You stop listening to reply and start listening to understand. That alone can transform relationships, because people don't just want to be heard, they want to be understood. And understanding starts with presence. Silence creates that presence. When you are silent, you remove your ego from the conversation. You're not trying to prove a point, win an argument, or insert your opinion. You're allowing space for someone else to show up fully. That space is healing. It tells the other person, you matter, your feelings matter. I am here, not to fix you, but to feel with you. That kind of emotional attentiveness is rare and powerful. It builds trust, it deepens empathy, it creates connection beyond words. Silence also allows for emotional processing. Feelings are not always clear or immediate. Sometimes you don't know how you feel until you sit quietly with yourself. Silence helps you untangle the emotional knots, to sit with sadness without rushing to distract, to honor your joy without needing to share it instantly, to acknowledge your fear without judgment. In doing so, you give yourself the freedom to feel fully, and that fullness leads to deeper emotional clarity. One of the most overlooked aspects of emotional intelligence is self-regulation, the ability to hold your emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Silence is where that ability is built. By practicing stillness in emotional moments, you teach your nervous system to stay grounded. You show yourself that emotions, even intense ones, can be observed without being acted upon immediately. That's where true strength lies, not in denying feelings, but in mastering your response to them. In silence, you grow emotionally not by doing more, but by simply being more aware of your patterns. Aware of your triggers, aware of the emotions of those around you, and from that awareness, better choices are made, kinder words, calmer reactions, wiser decisions. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, uncertain, or emotionally flooded, don't reach for noise. Don't rush to speak. Instead, reach for silence. Let it hold you. Let it guide you. Let it show you what's really going on inside, because in that quiet space, your emotional intelligence will not only grow, it will thrive, and through it, you will become not just more self-aware, but more compassionate, more grounded, and more human.